I'll say my little piece that I have to say. So welcome to everybody to the second in the series of EIG webinars being held over this summer. As participants are still joining, I'm just going to make a couple of quick points. Firstly, if you missed the first of our EIG webinars, which was David Payne providing us with an update on the UK mineral strategy, you can find the slides and the links to the recording on the EIG website. So that's eigconferences.com. Secondly, following today's webinar, there are going to be about 30 minutes available for questions. So I was just going to ask people to please type your questions into the Q&A section. There should be a button to that at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat option, but we're asking if you could please put the questions in the Q&A because they're easier for us to see them. If you put them in the chat, we might miss them. I can't guarantee that we'll see them. So thanks for doing that. That'd be great. So on to today's webinar. We are delighted to welcome Barnaby Harding as our second webinar speaker. Thank you very much for taking part. Barnaby is a technical director at Stantec UK. He is a chartered geologist with over 22 years of experience as a hydrogeologist, working on environmental development, mining and quarrying and infrastructure projects in the UK, New Zealand, Central Asia and India, I gather. So the title of his talk today is The Impact of Water Environment Considerations on the Development of Mineral Sites in the UK. So over to you, Barnaby.
Yes, thanks very much, Teresa. Trips off the tongue, doesn't it? So, yes, today I'm going to be talking about, I suppose, specific considerations, really, ones which have not been hitherto really important in deciding where sites go and on restrictions on where sites can go, and that's principally related to water resource considerations as a result of the removal of the dewatering exemptions for quarrying sites. So it's not about every environmental consideration on the water side. This is contents for the webinar today, a bit of introduction and background just to sort of set the scene, explain the sort of the main focus of the webinar, and then we'll run.
See your slides at the minute, Barnaby.
Oh, can you not? Ah, right, okay. I think it helps if I share my screen. That's what I was in my excitement. Okay, good. Just bear with me a second.
Yes, thanks, Barnaby.
Okay, could you just confirm that you can see that okay?
Not yet. I can't see share screen. No, I can't see it yet.
Okay, try again. Here we go. It's more like it.
That's it, Barnaby. That's perfect. I'll mute now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So yes, running through the contents, as I said, introduction, background, and then we'll be looking at three new considerations, really, in the light of the need to get abstraction licenses for dewatering, and that's the Water Framework Directive, water availability within catchments, and this concept of serious damage. What I've done is had a look at those and done a fairly high level risk assessment just to see how those things impact on the areas where there's high risk for getting sites sorted out and licenses for dewatering. I'll have a look at the solutions, potential solutions to overcome those issues. And then finally, some closing words and my thoughts on the way forward. So introduction first, as I said, this is really focusing on issues relating to dewatering and the need to get licenses now and what those changes mean for site development and the risks to developing sites in certain areas. So it's not about small scale environmental considerations. This is more larger scale water resources considerations. So looking at the regulatory side, and what's shown here are the sort of aspects that people will be familiar with in the development of sites, and I'm focusing here on sites that require dewatering. You've got the planning process and the permitting and consenting process. Planning process typically involving EIA done through the Mineral Planning Authority with inputs from consultees, and considering things like flood risk and the impact of changes in water levels, flows, quality on identified receptors and groundwater users. We're all pretty familiar with that. The permitting and consenting process involving the environmental permitting regime and also the Land Drainage Act for things like discharge permits and flood risk activity permits controlled by the EA, and then land drainage consents for things like works in ordinary water courses controlled by the council or carried out through the council. And those are really looking at similar sorts of things, similar considerations. So, you know, flood risk, changes in water level, quality, flow, etc. But now we've got the need for abstraction licenses. We have to consider some new things, or at least things which have been perhaps a little bit in the background previously. What we're now looking at is the abstraction licensing regime going through the Environment Agency, and we're looking at things like the water body status under the Water Framework Directive. We're looking at water availability issues, and we're looking at serious environmental damage, as well as all the other EIA considerations as well in terms of impacts. Now, the implications of this are quite significant. I think the figure on the right just shows areas where there's sort of limited water availability, and that might impact on the ability to abstract for dewatering purposes. And I think that this has the potential to almost sterilise areas of the UK from working and developing sites if dewatering is the only way to do it. And I think it's going to result in some nationwide changes in work practices as well. Very quickly, this is a figure that was produced a little while ago and is actually a bit out of date now in terms of timing, but just to illustrate that the abstraction licensing regime actually will move into the environmental permitting regime in due course. It was supposed to do that in 2021, but because of the coronavirus and various other things, I think probably as well, it's been pushed back. That shouldn't have any significant material difference other than perhaps in license application costs or permit application costs, but just to be aware of. So now I wanted to talk about Water Framework Directive and spend a little bit of time on that. It's fairly important to understand the context of this and the basics of this. So this is regulation which came into force in 2017. It's a European-wide directive, but it was essentially drafted in the UK. So I think you can effectively forget about it being ditched as a result of any kind of Brexit rationalisation of regulations within the UK. I think it's here to stay. And it has two main objectives. The first is to prevent deterioration of the ecological and chemical conditions within water bodies, both surface and groundwater, but also to achieve what's referred to as good ecological and chemical status by a certain date at the end of 2021. Now this figure just shows across Europe, you know, how far we've got to go with that. Really, most water bodies within that area are not meeting that good status. So, you know, the idea of getting it to there by the end of 2021 is a pretty ambitious one, and you know, requires a fair bit of work. So I'll talk about the status first, and then talk about deterioration second. So this is looking at surface water. I'll move on to groundwater in a second, but it illustrates the principles. So you've got on the left there a figure showing how the status is arrived at, and you can see the various classifications there, B for bad, P poor, moderate, good and high status, trying to get to the green one for everything, G. And in determining the status, it's the lowest score that goes through each of the stages. So you look at your various elements, score them, the lowest score goes through, and then you look at the two different ecological and chemical status, and the lowest element goes through there. So that's what determines your water body status. Groundwater, similar principle. This is between good and poor, and you can see really concentrate on the right hand side of that figure, which is the quantitative status, where there are 4 tests that determine that. And the one that we're really interested in for the purposes of this webinar is the water balance test. Actually, I should say thank you to Mike Streetley for these slides on WFD. These are not mine, but he knows an awful lot more about it than I do. So water balance test is one of the key ones, and it's basically an accounting exercise. So it's looking at water in and water out, and where that's not sustainable, there's more water going out than coming in, then there's a presumption against granting abstractions, and in fact there's a presumption against allowing abstractions potentially to increase beyond their current amounts, even if they're licensed. So whilst the water balance test is not a direct measure of environmental deterioration, and that has been a cause for challenge, the EA does see it as a very important one, a very valuable one, and it's one that allows other issues that aren't part of other WFD assessments to be included, as listed there in the second bullet point. And it also allows sensitivity testing regarding dry conditions and how the water balance is going to fare under different climatic conditions. So that was status. Now moving on to deterioration. This is relatively simple concept. You can see there the various status areas there, so bad, poor, moderate, etc. And deterioration is considered to be a downward change in class, or a deterioration within the lowest class, so within the groundwater that would be within poor. And this is assessed at sort of the large scale, the water body scale. And increased abstractions are a key driver for the risk of deterioration. So the EA really is not going to be happy, or not going to want to be allowing increases in abstraction where there is a risk of deterioration. And this is a forward-looking thing, if you like. This isn't a direct impact on the ecological status, but it's something that has the potential to impact on it in the future. And because it's not a direct impact, it does require understanding of the hydrogeology, and will require things like groundwater models to look at the groundwater side, and hydroecological models to sort of look at the interaction between the groundwater and surface water and ecology. And the groundwater abstraction side of things is relatively easy to track and to understand and to monitor, and that's over on the left-hand side there. But because there are a number of steps in the process, it becomes quite complex to sort of determine cause and effect with changes in groundwater abstraction in many cases. So there are complexities there. And it can take a significant amount of time for changes to be affected as well. So whilst you may see, key risk to deterioration being here, increases in groundwater abstraction or a poor water balance, the actual impacts and the change in the status is not going to happen until this point here. So you need to understand the aquifer, you need to understand interactions between aquifers and water bodies and receptors, surface water bodies and receptors. You need to understand things like how groundwater is changing over time, how things perform during dry periods and other responses to climate and climatic change. But the current situation in terms of status is this, as shown here. This is showing the groundwater status, good or poor. And you can see that there are large areas of the country where the groundwater status is currently regarded to be poor. And that's particularly in the southeast and along the eastern side of the country. And this is something which we'll look at in a minute or two in the risk assessment. Now moving on to water availability. So water availability is really about whether or not there's water there to be which can be licensed. So if you're dewatering at your site, is there water available to be licensed? And the water availability is published in what are called the CAMS documents, so Catchment Abstraction Management Strategy documents. So an example on the right hand side there for the CAM and ELUs. It categorises the water bodies in terms of the amount of water that's available, whether it's fully available or whether there's a restricted availability or whether there's no water available at all. Where water availability is restricted, you might see it only available at certain times. You might see things like what are referred to as hands-off flows or hands-off levels, which basically determine trigger levels below which you would need to stop your abstraction. This figure here on the left is taken from the same document, the CAM and ELUs, and shows the groundwater body in the catchment and the licensing resource position with that. And you can see that's all shaded red. So basically what that's telling you is that in this particular catchment, this groundwater body, there's no water available for licensing. If you tried to get a groundwater abstraction, you wouldn't be able to get the license. Over on the right hand side there, you can see the different sort of banding or categories of resource availability that are referred to in the CAMS documents, really just focusing on the middle three, the green, yellow and red. So you've got in the green, you've got water available for licensing. You should be able to get an abstraction license as long as you're not having any detrimental environmental impacts on local receptors. In this situation, you've got restricted water availability where there's not enough water available at full license. If everyone was to fully exercise their license, there wouldn't be enough water to maintain the environmental flows in water bodies in this situation. And there you'd have trouble getting a license, but you may be able to trade. So basically borrow someone else's or pay for someone else's license. And then you've got no water available for licensing in the red, where even at current abstraction rates, there's insufficient water for environmental flows in water bodies. But you still may possibly be able to get water by trading licenses in that circumstance. These two figures show, these are produced by the MPA, Mineral Products Association, and they show member sites superimposed on the CAMS resource availability categories. And on the left, sand and gravel and sand quarries, and on the right, crushed rock quarries. The lighter the colour here, basically the less water is available or the more restricted it is. It's only available at certain times. So you can see there are large areas, you know, the big areas here where there is restricted water availability, and if you're needing to dewater permanently, that's going to present you with a problem. So now on to serious damage. It's not that, although that is pretty bad. In fact, it's not really formally defined anywhere. The Welsh Government and DEFRA refer to it in a consultation response about withdrawal of compensation, which was issued in or published in November 2012. And it's a phrase which, or a term which appears in the Water Act in section 27, again with respect to compensation, and it's a circumstance under which compensation wouldn't be due if a license was revoked, i.e. taken away, or the quantities on it were reduced. That consultation document goes some way to explaining what the various principles are behind serious damage. So the first is about the magnitude and extent of it. You know, what's the scale of it? The second is about the qualitative nature of it, and that's really talking about the value of the thing that's being damaged. And then the third is about, it's sort of to do with timescales really, and how long the damage is likely to last for, how quick the recovery would be. So there are tables in there which give some examples of what might constitute damage and what might constitute serious damage. For principle 1, for example, you're looking at where the flows are reduced below natural flows, but not significantly. That would be not serious. But where you've got complete loss of flow, for example, in a river, that would be considered serious. And the various other sort of definitions there or examples. Principle 2, qualitative nature. Now, this sort of relates more to the things that we've been talking about with Water Framework Directive. So this is where you might be causing a deterioration or a reduction in the status of the water body. And that would be considered serious. Where you're resulting in a deterioration but no change within the status. If it's good, then that's not serious. And then the third principle, this is looking at timescales, as I mentioned. So things like, you know, is it only a flow reduction during drought periods, or is it outside of drought periods, and things like that. And I won't go through all of those, but some examples. So the issue here is that some water bodies, both surface, which is shown here, and groundwater bodies, have been classified as suffering from serious damage. And in those water bodies, one might expect potential issues in trying to get an abstraction license for a dewatering activity. The EA estimate that wouldn't be the case for most sites, but nevertheless, there are large areas classified like this, and you may run into issues. And this shows the groundwater body status here, produced by the EA. And you can see there are large areas, particularly in the east, where groundwater bodies have been classified as at serious damage. So I sort of took it upon myself to look at this. I was concerned about these new considerations and how they might have some fairly wide-reaching impacts in terms of the ability to develop sites. And so undertook a very simple, very basic risk assessment, which was really just to have a look at, you know, what's the scale of the issue, how does it affect potential development across the UK, or England and Wales, really. So in order to do that, I looked at the new data sets, so the WFD status, serious damage, groundwater bodies, water resource availability, and then clip those to the outcrop pattern for mineral occurrence, and basically assign them to different risk classes depending on whether they sat in serious damage or poor status or limited water resource availability, and basically just high to low risk, with a high risk being an area where you might expect quite a bit of trouble to get an abstraction license, and low risk one where you would probably get one without too much trouble. I looked at these are the results, looked at three different resource types, also 3 different mineral types: limestone, sandstone, and then sands and gravels. So red is high risk, yellow to brown is moderate risk, and low risk is in green. So for limestone, you can see that if you needed to dewater, and this is all about if you need a license, if you needed to dewater, you see there are large areas there where you may run into problems doing that. You know, it's partly a geographic, or possibly mostly a geographic thing really, in that they are located over more on the eastern and southeastern part of the country. For sandstone, it's not so much of an issue. Again, largely a geographic reason for that. Most sandstone sites are in the west and the north, but you can see some issues down there in the southeast and the east. And then sands and gravels. A bit hard to see this possibly for those viewing in, but yeah, again, large areas. East Anglia, a real potential problem trying to get licenses for dewatering there. And I think sand and gravel is probably the more critical, because in many sand and gravel sites, what you've got is a shallow water table, and dewatering is quite likely, and mitigating measures are going to be difficult to implement. So this shows it in a slightly different form. I suppose the key thing here is that we've got significant areas that fall into certainly into the medium or moderate risk category, but in some cases the high risk areas are pretty significant proportion of the whole. So solutions. I'll run through a number of potential solutions here. The first is license trading, and I sort of touched upon that a little bit earlier. And this is where you find someone who's willing to hand over part or all of their water right. So it's an existing water right, and they're willing to hand it over to you. This is done through the EA, and you can look at various types. You can be taking all of the right part of the right, or you can be doing it on a temporary or a permanent basis. It depends what you're after. There are issues with this. Finding suitable partners is obviously the main one. There may not be people who are wishing to trade. Timeframes is another issue. There's obviously an EA process to be gone through. But there's a partner negotiation to be gone through as well, because this is essentially a sort of a private agreement, albeit done through the EA to formalise it. So there's a financial risk there. There's a financial risk as well, a time risk. So the outcome of all of this is uncertain. You don't know whether you're going to find a trading partner or whether they're going to be suitable to deal with. So some uncertainty there. Another option is to work the mineral wet. Now this sort of bypasses the whole issue, really, I suppose, in that you're not dewatering, so you don't need a license, which is great. So you don't need to worry about all that stuff. But there are issues. It's not suitable for every occasion. Things like depth of mineral, very shallow water tables, different mineral types. Some of them are going to be suitable, some of them are not. There are logistical issues with it. It's different plant, requires a stable platform by the edge of the water body, the flooded pit. It's not as efficient. You have to allow time for draining, and there's a bit of rehandling involved as well. It needs different equipment. And so all of this leads to increased costs potentially. Is offset to a certain degree by the pumping costs, which you don't have to pay for, but it's still a potential net increase in cost. And then there's infiltration. So in this case, what you're doing is you're taking water from your pit and you're transporting it across to an infiltration feature and allowing it to go back into the aquifer, into the same aquifer that you've dewatered it from. Now, this would require an abstraction license still, but it's almost a net zero abstraction, net abstraction from the resource. So the issues there are that it needs a license still. It may require a discharge permit. Clearly, there are issues with where to put these things. You know, they can be quite significant size features, large ponds, trenches, that sort of thing. You may end up pumping more because you're getting recirculation from your infiltration feature into the quarry. And then there's the issue of getting the water into the ground in the first place. I mean, the ground may not simply may not accept the water that's being pumped from the site. It's worth just going into some of those issues a little bit briefly. So in terms of location, this is, you know, there's going to be a different situation for new sites as there is for existing sites where you're looking to increase pumping rates or you're looking at extensions, things like that. Old sites are unlikely to have considered infiltration features as part of the development proposals. So you may run into issues there just in terms of finding space for it. New sites, there's the opportunity to look at that, but obviously it takes up space which you may not want to give up. You could be looking at a couple of different or a number of different ways of doing this. Off-site pond is one way to do it, which may be near or further away from the quarry pit, or you may be looking at things like perimeter infiltration trenches as well. That's another way to do it. But they all take up space. Then you've got the ability of the ground to accept the water and hydraulic issues. Infiltration testing for soakage is pretty well established. There's a standard way of doing that, but it does tend to focus on short-term infiltration rates, and there are issues once you start looking at long-term infiltration rates that aren't really fully allowed for in those assessments. And one of the main issues here is upconing or mounding of the groundwater beneath the infiltration feature. The figure there shows some sort of key concepts really. On the right-hand side, you've got a dewatered quarry. The solid blue line's the rest water table. Dotted is the dewatered water table. If you have a quarry and an infiltration feature which are sort of essentially the same in terms of their geometry, so two pits, for example, same size, then what you'd expect to see is a mirror image at the infiltration site. You'll get a mirror image of the cone of depression around the quarry exhibiting itself as a cone of what they call a cone of impression or a mound around the infiltration feature. Now that's okay potentially, but as you can see there, if you've got a fairly shallow water table, then you're going to have issues getting the water into the ground. You can only get water up to or close to the ground surface. So in reality, that's going to limit what you can get in. Your infiltration rate will be lower than what you're dewatering, and therefore you've still got to get rid of that water. You can't get it into the ground. So this is all sort of locally dependent on local conditions. We've got time-dependent issues, as I mentioned. So this graph just shows the groundwater level, sort of typical pattern of groundwater level beneath an infiltration feature over time. Don't worry about the scale or the units, the pattern, that's the thing. But what's happening here is as water levels rise, water is filling storage within the aquifer, and the initial rates are going to be quite high as the water fills that storage, but as the storage gets filled up, then rates tend to drop off. So you'll see the ability to get the water into the ground decreases, and you sort of get it can be a fairly significant decrease in the amount of water going into the ground over time. And then finally, recirculation. So this shows an off-site pond here within the capture zone of a quarry pit. And what will happen here is, as you infiltrate the water, it will work its way from the pond back into the pit. You get a recirculation going on. You get increased pumping. It decreases the effective infiltration that's going on. And you may find that you can't actually support the full dewatering rate within that pond. So, yeah, tricky things to determine and work out. And finally, there's a sort of, I guess, what I call a regulatory solution. And I suppose this is all I could say on that one. It's something which perhaps can be explored. I really don't know about the potential for looking at that, but something that's worth raising, I suppose, to see whether there's anything that can be done there. I suspect not. So, final closing words, really, and a sort of a look at the way forward there. As I mentioned, I think this represents a significant risk to the industry. You know, I don't want to be alarmist, but you know, the concept of no-go areas where you can't develop sites that require dewatering. There's increased costs associated with sort of allowing for the mitigation measures. And, you know, all of this has a sort of knock-on effect on the ability to replenish mineral. You know, are we going to be actually replenishing at the sufficient rates? I mean, that's always an issue anyway. And the industry and regulators are, to be honest, a little bit in a learning process with this, and both trying to understand what the issues are. And what I'm trying to do with this is to bring this up the table of issues, really, as an important one. And it's key to say, I've highlighted it here, that this isn't some sort of esoteric thing in the future. This is already happening, and it's already impacting on sites. I'm personally involved with sites where it's extremely challenging getting hold of an abstraction license for dewatering, and there are obviously costs associated with that. And I am aware of sites where this may have actually resulted in them, you know, not going ahead with development and looking elsewhere. In terms of dealing with it at this stage, certainly twin tracking and you know, considering these issues early is something that I would advise, and people have been talking about the twin tracking the planning and permitting process or licensing process, and that's definitely something which is worth doing. Unfortunately, there's no sort of one-size-fits-all solution to these things. It does depend on your local conditions, but I do think it needs this industry-wide response, and I think the regulator needs to be involved in that discussion as well. There are a couple of things that might help. You've seen the fairly, I guess, noddy risk assessment that's been done, but useful nonetheless, I think. There's potential to refine that, and it could easily be turned into a useful tool for planning, working out where your site's probably best placed. So look at some additional factors in that, and then I think there's a potential here to develop some sort of rules of thumb guidelines for industry to deal with this dewatering issue. And I'm thinking about things like perhaps simple rules of thumb for infiltration, when it will and when it won't work, and sort of some basic rules of design. Of course, who's going to pay for all of that is the question. I've managed to do that risk assessment fairly quickly off my own bat, but this is a bit more involved. So that's it really. Food for thought. It's certainly not the end of it. I just want to raise all of these things so that they get dealt with and they're sort of foremost in people's minds. And with that, I shall come to an end. A little bit over, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. And happy to take questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Barnaby. I don't have a problem with you being slightly over time, because that was actually really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot personally. If you'd like to just stop sharing your screen when you
okay.
Good, and then we'll go on to the questions. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in already. So good. So we'll start at the top. It says, are the water risk areas available anywhere as GIS layers or shapefiles? That they mean the ones that you... The ones that
I've generated.
Yeah.
No, they're not at the moment. They're just sitting on my computer essentially. They were just generated by me. Whether they could be made available is another question. I mean, I'm happy to discuss that with people if they want to contact me directly.
Okay.
Or certainly, all of the source data that they use is freely available.
Is that on the EA website or something?
It comes from various sources, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, a number of different sources.
Okay. Oh, there was another question there that disappeared and come back again. Okay, so it's the next one says, "Hi Barnaby, good presentation. Do you think that the new focus on water balance and impact on water resources will be a driver for improved techniques of artificial recharge of groundwater to return pumped groundwater to the aquifers? This seems to be happening in the construction industry, which has similar issues. In construction, the EA has sometimes indicated that 100% recharge means that a license is not required, which would be a very good way for the regulation to evolve."
Yes, yes, quite. I tried to explore some of those mitigation measures in the presentation, and I think, as I mentioned, it's important. I think it's important that perhaps we look at this a bit more. I don't think there's enough out there at the moment in terms of guidelines on how to do this. There are some good publications that can deal with sort of dewatering, and I've seen some people on the attendee list who are involved with that. But in terms of infiltration, yeah, I'm not aware of any sort of good guidelines that are out there that can help with this, and I think that's really where we need to focus. Actually, is to have a look at, well, it's one of the areas of focus is looking at producing some guidelines for that. It can be quite complex. It's very dependent on the local geometry. There are multiple parameters that impact on how effective infiltration is going to be, and one of the main issues is what I was in that sort of cross-section figure I was showing, which is that the infiltration impact on groundwater table is a sort of mirror image of the quarry dewatering kind of depression. That in itself just presents issues, because if you're going to have anything smaller than that, then you're potentially, as an infiltration feature, then you're potentially looking at very, very limited ability to get water into the ground unless you've got a very deep water table. So, you know, you're talking about big areas potentially. So yeah, it's a tricky one. Needs looking at.
Okay. So the next question says, with infiltration, would there be a likelihood that a planning authority will require management of the new water body, and what would happen once pumping stops to that new water body?
The water body being the infiltration feature itself, I suppose they're referring to. That's a good question. I'm not sure I've considered that. I don't think that would be an issue if it was closed. If there were no inlets and outlets to it, I don't think that would, and people can say if I'm wrong, but I don't think that would constitute something that you would then need to consider in terms of water resources. So no, hopefully that wouldn't be too much of an issue.
Okay. There's a question here asking about whether the recording will be available, and the answer to that is yes, it will be available. It will, Clive will be putting it onto the EIG YouTube channel after this session. So that one's quite easy to answer. So the next question for you, Barnaby, is have you had much experience in dealing with sites whereby quarry dewatering is not wholly or mainly groundwater, i.e. it is in a largely impermeable strata with little or no groundwater ingress? Are these being treated differently?
Ooh, that's, yes, okay. So it depends a little bit where you are, actually, that question, and there are slight differences between England and Wales, and they're taking a different approach to wholly or mainly groundwater. In England, the EA have taken a pretty pragmatic approach, and there's some guidance out there which defines the proportions of water coming from rainwater and groundwater, which then define whether or not you need a license. So if it's a certain percentage of rainwater, then you won't need a license for it. I think it's about 75% of rainwater. In Wales, it's less it's less pragmatically dealt with, should I say, and there's no real cut-off. So any water that's coming from any groundwater that's coming in is seen as essentially making the whole thing licensable. Yeah, so it depends where you are. If it requires a license, it requires a license, and whether it's low permeability or not, it should be seen in the same light, and the same issues apply as what we've just been talking about. But yeah, I mean, we have been dealing with all sorts of sites actually, including that sort of thing.
So is it possible to act? This is just a follow up from me while we wait for somebody else to answer. Is it possible to kind of test the water that's collecting in the bottom of a void and work out whether it's rainwater or groundwater?
You could do. I don't think anyone has. It's a trouble with the wording. This wholly or mainly phrase is something that's enshrined in legislation. And so people have been, it's one of those useful phrases that are a bit like, like a little bomb that just goes off, and throw it in, and people then have to deal with it. So it's really about how is that defined? What is the definition of wholly or mainly? And at the moment, the guidance is, because it needs to be pragmatic, it's based on things like catchment area. So it's looking at rainfall. You calculate rainfall over the catchment area of the pit and work out how much that is as a proportion of the total volume being pumped. So it's a fairly simple calculation.
Yeah, okay. I could just see sort of disputes arriving between somebody saying, no, it's mostly rainwater, and somebody else saying, no, it's mostly groundwater. Yeah.
I mean, we've got sites where it's not so much that. I think everybody's kind of bought into the let's keep it simple, let's go with that guidance. People are happy with that. There's not too much dispute over the calculations for that. And that's in England. In Wales, it's a lot more tricky because it's a lot more stringent, and we've got sites where there's a very small amount of groundwater coming in and a vast amount of rainwater coming in, and it's a bit of a nonsense really having to license it. It just doesn't make sense. But that's just the implications of the interpretation.
Yeah. So the next question that's come in, it says, with respect to HoF restrictions, for many mineral sites, this seems counterintuitive for protection of surface water courses, since the ceasing of dewatering and discharge at times of low flow would further exacerbate such low flow situations within surface watercourses. What is the regulator's position on this, please?
I'm not sure. Probably best to ask the regulator. I'm not absolutely sure about that. I mean, you saw the reference there to earlier with respect to Water Framework Directive anyway, about sort of offsetting the groundwater abstraction impacts by saying, oh well, it's to augment surface water flows, and that isn't, certainly with the groundwater balance test, that isn't allowed. That's not, you know, that's not sufficient reason to allow it. Hands-off flow, I suppose it is a slightly different question though. Hands-off flows. Yeah, I agree. It is counterintuitive. I think it would depend on how you're getting rid of the water. If you are, I mean, I think a hands-off flow is a relevant thing to have if you're not going to be augmenting the flow. If you're going to be augmenting, so there's a river next to your site, and you're dewatering, if you're going to be putting that water back into the river, then I would say, yeah, there should be a discussion about whether it's relevant to have a hands-off flow, because you're augmenting it. And I think the EA would listen to that.
Yeah, it's about having that conversation,
isn't
it, really, with the regulators and seeing what they will accept.
Yeah.
I don't actually have another question yet, but we have a statement on the chat that just says there's a regulatory position statement on wholly or mainly groundwater is available on gov.uk. So anybody else who's interested can go to gov.uk and look for that. No other questions at the moment.
Teresa, can you see the question from?
Found them. It's okay.
Oh, you got it. Good.
Yeah. Is the EA's approach to licensing permitting gradually becoming a barrier to planning, and is there now a need for a one-stop shop?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by a one-stop shop. Is it, you mean in terms of rolling up planning, permitting, and licensing all into one? Is it? Is that the?
I think that's what he's meaning. It's Nick from the MPA. So yeah.
Ah, okay, yeah. Well, I think I think we should treat it. We should certainly treat it as such. We should look at everything. It's about this twin tracking, really. We should, from our side, from the industry side, we should be looking at considering everything right from the beginning, I think, and dealing with all of those planning, permitting, licensing issues as a whole. Okay, I mean, they then go off to the various regulatory bodies to be looked at, but I think certainly if we deal with them in that way, that helps. I mean, the thing is that in the planning process, what's happened previously, which has sort of made a bit of a nonsense of things, I think, is that planning applications have gone in. The EA is consulted on those planning applications. It wasn't really within their remit to look at water resource issues at that point, or for whatever reason they weren't really considered in the same way that they are now. And the planning went through. Then subsequently, you would have, as we have now, the licenses being applied for, the abstraction licenses being applied for, and the EA are having another look at them, and all of these things are coming up. So you've got sites where this planning is approved, and the EA's had a look at this, now coming up with problems because they need to get a license, and the EA is saying, oh well, there's no water available, whatever status is poor, or those sorts of things. So I'm hoping that that's just a historical thing, and that we're just going to have to work our way through it. I think now that everybody knows what's required, that all of these things will be looked at as part of the planning process anyway. The EA will be looking towards their abstraction licensing role a bit later on. So we'll be bringing these things up.
Okay, we've just got time for a couple more quick questions. So the next one is there a scope for a mineral extraction to be designed so that it provides a benefit to an area with depleted groundwater resources?
Oh gosh, that's I'm trying to think how that would happen. Is this about transferring water across from one groundwater body to another, perhaps? I mean, there is the potential for that. Thing is, you're normally talking about relatively close proximity between the dewatering point and the infiltration point. It can certainly help with surface water. Not sure about groundwater though.
So the next question is, do you think that changes in the regulatory environment for managing ground and surface water may lead to quarrying activities being seasonally restricted or seasonally permitted? After all, in large parts of the world, quarrying is rarely operational all year round.
Yeah. I mean, it might well. Certainly, in areas where there's limited water resource available, there would potentially be seasonal restrictions. And we may have to accept that that's the sort of the mode of working from now on in some places. That's not something that I specifically mentioned in the presentation, but yeah, it's a change to work practices. Can't rule that out. It's about economics, really, whether that works economically.
That has quite significant implications in terms of moving of aggregates around the country in different seasons. Anyway, interesting. And then the next one is, would you agree that we need improved live data of abstraction rates on approved abstractions, so to allow assessment of underutilization and thus the likelihood of possible trading opportunities?
I don't know enough about the ins and outs of abstraction licenses in terms of the day-to-day operation of them. I mean, that's a question which, excuse me, that's a question which the EA might be better placed to answer. Yeah, I mean, the more data you have, the more you can fine tune these things, and particularly if you're pushing up against that limit of resource, the better you understand things, the more you can maximize it, optimize it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that is all of the questions, and we're almost bang on our time. How about that? That's fabulous. I think. So just finalise again by saying thank you very much to Barnaby for a very good presentation, a very interesting presentation. Thank you to everybody who has signed in to listen and to all of those questions. That's really great. Over to you, Clive, to sort out the recording, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. The recording will go onto YouTube, everybody. We'll send you a link. It will have the Q&A as well. And I suppose one last point, Teresa, will be to remind people that if they wish to give an EIG webinar, then please get in touch with us.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.